Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I am Matthew Silverman, Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our lecture with Professor Pamela Nadell, who will be discussing her new book, Antisemitism and American Tradition. We extend our heartfelt thanks to Mark Kahn for sponsoring this lecture in memory of Arnold Hammer, Martin Goldman, and George Johnson. All three were lifelong Jewish learners, devoted members of Mark's study group for half a century, and whose contributions had profound and lasting effect on the Institute. We also extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our Fall 2025 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Thank you to those of you who have donated to the Haberman Institute this year. Your generosity makes it possible for us to offer meaningful lectures on Jewish thought, history, and culture free of charge. If you haven't yet contributed, we encourage you to consider donating before the end of the year. Every gift, large and small, helps sustain our mission. Our next program is Session 2 with Rachel Korazim on three great Hebrew poets. This class continues tomorrow at 1 p.m. and will focus on the poetry of Shaul Chernyakhovsky. For more information on this program and to view last week's session on Chaim Nachman Bialik, please visit our website. As always, feel free to submit your questions tonight via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kindly keep your questions concise and incomplete sentences. We will address them at the end of the lecture, though you can submit them at any point during the presentation. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Professor Pamela Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program. Her book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the 2019 Jewish National Book Awards Jewish Book of the Year. The Wall Street Journal named her new book, Antisemitism and American Tradition, to its best books for October. Professor Nadell is a member of the team advising the rebuild of Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue. To her chagrin, she is probably best known for testifying before Congress in the hearing with the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. And with that, I now welcome Professor Nadell to join us and share her expertise.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here this evening to return, as I have so often, to the Haberman Institute. I even remember when I was living already in Washington when it was founded. It's a really extraordinary institute and institution for Jewish learning, and it's a privilege to join you once again. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And let's make sure you can all see that. And so this is the cover of the book, which is what has brought me here this evening. And I want to talk, although it's a history and it starts actually in the 17th century, as you will learn, I actually want to start by talking about anti-Semitism and hate in America today. And I think many on this webinar this evening will remember Charlottesville's August 2017, the Unite the Right rally, where the organizers had plotted in advance that when they would march through the University of Virginia on the Friday night before their official rally, they plotted that they would chant, "Jews will not replace us." And as you know, they marched through with tiki torches and Nazi salutes evoking the Nazi era. And ultimately, jurors found the main organizers of what became a deadly rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, found them liable under state law, but and awarded more than $25 million in damages to some of the people who were counter protesters there. So you will remember that. I think you will also remember the Tree of Life. 1 year later, on October 27th, 2018, in Pittsburgh, the single deadliest incident in American Jewish history so far. 11 Jews were murdered while worshiping inside the Tree of Life Synagogue building. But my other examples of contemporary anti-Semitism, I don't think will be quite as familiar. A Chabad center at the University of Delaware that an arsonist torched in 2020. This slide shows the synagogues that were targeted in April of 2021 in New York City. And this was even before Operation Guardian of the Walls, which was the last Gaza war before the one that's been going on since October 7th. And then I'm just going to kind of jump to 2025 and to the murders at the Capitol Jewish Museum when a young couple leaving an event for Jewish professionals were gunned down by someone who boasted that he was going to free Palestine. What brought me to write this book? I'm a historian. I only worked on this book for 6 years, which is actually pretty fast for a historian. It's not a post-October 7th book. It was the shock of the Tree of Life Synagogue that really set me on this journey. First of all, I know that we cannot understand the present if we don't know about the past. I also am well aware from having taught all sorts of subjects in Jewish studies over the course of my career that pogroms, the Inquisition, the Holocaust are part of Jewish collective memory. But the incidents, most of the incidents of American anti-Semitism are not part of Jewish collective memory. And what happened after the murders at the Tree of Life was that the trauma that inflicted on the Jews of Pittsburgh, and in fact on all of Pittsburgh, that trauma swirled out to American Jews. And my tiny little circle of American Jewish historians, we began meeting to talk about how had we essentially missed this story. We had written reams of books about American Judaism, I had just finished a book on America's Jewish women. We'd written about the different Jewish communities in America, the different branches of Judaism, but we had missed the anti-Semitism story. In fact, the last really good book on anti-Semitism in America was published in 1994. And it seemed that anti-Semitism was so insignificant that as early as the year 2000, somebody wrote a book called The Death of American Anti-Semitism. But it was clear by October 2018, if not by Charlottesville in 2017, and frankly, even earlier, that anti-Semitism was still an American problem. It had never died. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to take you through a bit of the book to show you where I start, give you a kind of sense of the arc of the story. And we'll start with anti-Semitism in colonial days and the early republic, and we'll talk about Jews as blasphemers and enemies. Because Peter Stuyvesant, who was the governor of New Amsterdam, which was the Dutch colony in Manhattan that was founded before it became New York, Peter Stuyvesant did not like Jews. We know he didn't like Jews from when he was actually a governor in one of the Caribbean colonies. But in September of 1654, 23 Jews fleeing persecution out of Brazil, because Brazil had been a Dutch colony which allowed Jews, but then it had been conquered once again by the Portuguese. Portugal did not allow Jews. 23 Jews fled Portuguese Brazil, and they landed in New Amsterdam. And Stuyvesant didn't want them there. He wanted to kick them out. So he wrote a letter to the Dutch West India Company back in Amsterdam, which actually controlled the colony and set colonial policy. And he called the Jews this, and I'll quote, a deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. In his letter, he continued that the Jews should not be allowed to stay because they were usurers, referring to the notion that Jews were moneylenders in the Middle Ages. He talked about them as being deceitful traders with Christians. He even used the phrase that they should no longer be allowed to infect the colonies. And that's a reference to the notion that the Jews were bearers of disease. That takes us back to the Black Death of the 14th century. In fact, the only libel he did not level at the Jews in this letter was the fact that they committed the blood libel, the ritual murder accusation that Jews use the blood of humans in their religious ceremonies. But he didn't mention that. Colonial preachers certainly did. The point is that Stuyvesant wanted to expel the Jews, and he didn't get away with it. The Dutch West India Company needed colonizers, needed people for its colonies, and they allowed them to stay. But what we see across these early days, when we're talking about such a tiny Jewish community that on the eve of the revolution, at the most, there were 2,500 Jews and maybe as few as 1,000. One of the things that we learn about this early period is how do you solve the problem of being a Jew? Well, of course, what you do is you get them to convert. So by the 18 teens, the the new Americans of the early republic are creating organizations like this one, the American Society for Ameliorating the Condition of the Jews, and they're evangelizing them because they want them to become Christian, and then there won't be a problem any longer of having Jews in America. What you may not realize is that the people who join these organizations are some of the most esteemed members of the early Republic society. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams was listed as a vice president. Eventually, he would become president. But also the presidents of Yale, Princeton, and Rutgers were among the officers of this organization. So I'm going to jump because the American Jewish community remains pretty small up until the Civil War. But I'm going to jump to the emergence of a full-fledged anti-Semitic society from the Civil War to World War I. First thing that I want to say is to give a sense of what I mean by a full-fledged anti-Semitic society. The way anti-Semitism comes to permeate so many parts of American Jewish life, way beyond the religious discriminations that I pointed out earlier. And what gives this era the movement towards the full-fledged anti-Semitic society was Ulysses S. Grant's December 1862 General Orders Number 11, where he tried to expel the Jews from his military district, which actually ran all the way from the southern tip of Illinois to the Gulf of Mexico. And he wanted to expel them because he considered them as a class violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department. He was basically accusing the Jews of smuggling materials to the Confederacy or smuggling cotton out of the Confederacy, but he wasn't expelling anyone else. And believe me, while there were certainly Jews who were involved in this, there were lots and lots of other people who were also involved in smuggling on both sides of the conflict. What is remarkable about this decision, of course, is that once President Lincoln heard about it, he overturned it. It actually affected probably only about 100 Jews. That had to do with breakdowns in communications. And Ulysses S. Grant, when he became president, tried to make up for what he had done by appointing many Jews to public office. But the idea of an expulsion, which Stuyvesant had not succeeded in getting, the idea of that expulsion echoed for Jews in America the expulsions of the past. Starting in 1290, Jews were expelled from England. They were then kicked out of France. And of course, those on this webinar today will be familiar with the great expulsion of perhaps as many as 200,000 Jews out of Spain in 1492. So that sets the stage. This is also the era, and it's why we can call this a full-fledged anti-Semitic society. It is also the era when a new word for hating Jews is coined. There's older terminology for anti-Judaism. I'm showing you here David Nierenberg's masterful book about anti-Judaism. It was also called Jew hate. It was also called Judeophobia. Anti-Semitism is coined as a new word in this period. And the first thing I would like to point out is that there are different ways of spelling anti-Semitism. For a long time, it was spelled with a hyphen and a capital S. We'll see why it shouldn't be spelled that way in a minute. There was also battles over, and they continue actually down to today, over how do you define anti-Semitism, and also, and maybe we'll get into this also later, when is anti-Zionism also a manifestation of anti-Semitism? I've given you here 3 definitions. I'm not going to delve into the definitions. I don't delve into them in the book, but I'm certainly well aware of them. I'll be honest, my favorite definition for anti-Semitism or an anti-Semite is someone who hates Jews more than absolutely necessary, attributed to Isaiah Berlin. But I want to turn back to the creation of this brand new word. Wilhelm Marr was a journalist, and he believed that in the wake of the entrance of Jews into European civilization, that there was a war underway, a war between Jews and Germans, and the Jews were winning. He even says that in this book that he writes about this war of the Jews over the Germans, he even says that Jews should be sent back to Palestine. That would be the solution. Get them out of Europe. But he needed a new word to explain his animosity towards Jews, because in the old definition, a Jew who converted became a Christian and therefore was no longer theoretically subject to anti-Semitism. Of course, the victims of the Inquisition, the Christian victims of the Inquisition who were of Jewish descent, learned a very different lesson about that. But for Marr, he was building on decades of writing of this new pseudoscience of the races and their fixed hierarchy and immutability. And he used the word anti-Semitism. He was taking Semite from linguistics, from the notion of related Semitic languages, languages related to Hebrew and Arabic and Aramaic. There are no such thing as Semitic peoples, but he came up with this idea of Semites as a way of saying that against Semites, against the people who have racially distinctive Jewish blood and Jewish physiognomy and Jewish ideas. And he feared that if these nefarious Semites did not leave Germany, it was going to be the end of Germany. There is a straight line from Wilhelm Marr to the Holocaust. But that happened in Europe. The word, by the way, comes to America almost immediately. And lots of anti-words in American history are anti and then a hyphen, and then they have a word following them. So anti-suffrage, for example. What I want to do now is show you a few examples of how this full-fledged anti-Semitic society works in the latter part of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th. You probably have not heard of Joseph Seligman. Seligman was a Bavarian Jewish immigrant who came to the United States. He started out in a small shop, as so many Bavarian Jews did, and he eventually became a banker, a friend of Ulysses S. Grant. He was even offered the position of Secretary of the Treasury, which he turned down. And in 1877, he went to stay at the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs, New York, a hotel where he had stayed in the past. And he was turned away under a new no Israelite policy. By the way, the words Israelite and Hebrew were often used, went too fast, synonymously. And rather than using the word Jew, because Jew was often seen as a pejorative, it was also in this time, in the 19th century, it's also used as a verb, a negative verb. So that's one element. The other element of this late 19th century era is the origin of the idea that Jews are out to replace the real Americans, the white Americans. This is a cartoon from the late 19th century, and you can see in it, you see John Smith and Co., their sign being taken down. And at the top, although it's hard to see, the sign that's coming in says Moses Eckstein and Sons. You can see over here the Jerusalem Herald. And what I want you to observe is that the Jews who are in this picture, who are taking over the city, most of them are well-to-do Jews. These are the Jews who had come to America in the decades before the Civil War and after the Civil War. But in this next image that we see here, we have the other group of Jews who are also threatening to take over America. Mother Russia, or actually it looks like Father Russia, is pushing the Jews out of Russia. They're coming in, and these are poor Jews. They're renaming the city, their New Jerusalem. The signs on the walls, the signs on the stores over here, one of them I think even says Seligman. And where are the real Americans going, marked by their suitcases? In fact, down here, it's Schuyler. So if you know the name Schuyler from the Hamilton musical, the Schuylers and the Van Beekmans, where are they fleeing? They're fleeing New York to go to the West. The last image from this period of this full-fledged anti-Semitic society refers to Leo Frank and his lynching. Leo Frank was a pencil factory manager in Atlanta. He had come from the North. And on Confederate Memorial Day in 1913, Mary Fagan went to retrieve her paycheck for that week, which was she was earning pennies on the hour, and she was not seen alive again. And suspicion fell on Leo Frank. The trial was an absolute circus. Leo Frank's mother wrote a letter to the Washington Post where she talked about the slurs in the trial against her faith. And Leo Frank was convicted, sentenced to die. He was convicted on the testimony of an African-American janitor who was an ex-convict. As his defense attorney said at the trial, no, only a Jew would have been convicted on this testimony. And ultimately, the governor of Georgia became convinced on the day that Frank was supposed to hang that there had been a miscarriage of justice, and he commuted Frank's death sentence to life imprisonment. So some men from Mary Fagan's town broke into the jail without firing a shot, took him out, and lynched him. And the Leo Frank affair cast a pall not only across Atlanta Jews, but really across American Jews. And they compared it. Back in those days, it was talked about as if this were the American Dreyfus Affair. For those of you who know the story of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who was wrongfully convicted of espionage and ultimately exonerated. And even, I mean, continues to make news now. The French Assembly recently, I think, promoted him to brigadier general. So we have a full-fledged anti-Semitic society with the sense of so many of the themes that we've been talking about today already at play. That will bring us to an uncomfortable place for Jews through World War II and beyond. The man who sets the stage was Henry Ford. Henry Ford was, as you all know, an auto magnate. You may not know that he was actually contemplating a run for president. He also owned a newspaper. He bought the Dearborn Independent, and in May of 1920, he launched a 91-week-long series, The International Jew, The World's Problem. In that series, he republished parts of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is the granddaddy of all anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. First published in Russia in 1903, brought to America by Russian nationalists fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution, and published in America thanks to Ford. What I think you might find interesting is that it had a very wide reach. Even today, you can read it. And it was translated into multiple languages. He actually published the columns in 4 volumes. They were never copyrighted, so everybody could read them. And one of his admirers was the head of the Bavarian Fascisti Party in March of 1923. His name was Adolf Hitler. And Hitler wrote, he actually gave an interview to this Chicago Tribune reporter where he said that if he could, he would send some of his shock troops to America to help Ford because he especially admired his anti-Jewish policy. You may also remember that as recently as a few years ago, a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was found at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. So what turns this era into an uncomfortable place for Jews? And that, by the way, is a quote from a minister who was talking about some of these issues. First of all, in 1922, on the front page of the New York Times, A. Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard, explains that Harvard is going to institute a quota on the number of Jews admitted because that will be how you solve the problem of the Jews. If there aren't so many, then it will be a much better situation. Many of you will have heard of the quotas in colleges and universities, but you may not realize that they extended to more than 700 colleges and universities, and they persisted well after World War II. They really don't begin to fall until the 1960s and the 1970s. You may also be aware that there were signs like this posted all over the United States. No, privileges of the swimming pool extended only to Gentiles, approved Gentiles, Christians only, Jews not allowed. I've also seen other signs. I don't show it, but there's an amazing museum that collects this kind of memorabilia. It's a museum about the Jim Crow era, and and other signs would say no, and then the N word, no Jews, no dogs. There were also ads like these, and I've circled the parts that I wanted you to see. First of all, when you wanted to rent an apartment, apartments could advertise Gentiles only. That's the one on the left. That's from 1942. In fact, Holocaust survivors who came to America found that they came right up against this restriction. something that we don't tend to think about. They knew anti-Semitism in Europe. Now they discover it also in America. And then this is commercial employment agencies. This is from the Brooklyn Eagle in 1925. So those under a certain age will have no idea what this is. These are want ads. In the old days, when you wanted to rent an apartment or find a job, you opened your newspaper and there were ads. And these ads were actually sex segregated. So these are want ads for women. And they're secretarial, typist, stenographer positions, clerk positions, and look at all the ads that say Christians only. In this era, Jews knew that there were so many businesses where they could not get hired. Employment agencies knew not to send people to American Telephone and Telegraph, one of the largest employers in the United States, because it would hire only Gentiles. These restrictions will fall after World War II. The quotas in colleges and universities would end. The restrictive covenants about not being able to buy a house in a certain neighborhood would end. Fair employment practices would come in. And the landmark legislation of this era, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And then I think it important to see that in this image, right behind President Johnson was Martin Luther King Jr., but to our right, his left, was Congressman Emanuel Seller, an immigrant who served in Congress for 50 years and who had fought against the restrictions that impeded life for Jews in America and for African Americans and others. So in this period, when we move, beyond World War II, structural anti-Semitism, these kinds of restrictions declined, but the roots of our current moment in which anti-Semitism came from white supremacists and Christian nationalists and from the left remain. And what I'd like to do is move back to the present, talk first about white supremacy, and then anti-Semitism coming from the left. So we opened with white nationalists and neo-Nazis chanting "Jews will not replace us" at the Unite the Right rally. The question is, what does this mean? In its most straightforward interpretation, it's a phrase that says that Jews will not replace us, meaning whites, in our rightful place as the dominant power in society. 6 weeks before this rally, Eric Ward, a deeply influential and courageous figure in the movement for racial and social justice, realized, he wrote this essay called Skin in the Game, where he explained what he had come to understand of white nationalism. He understood that the deep frustrations white supremacists felt after Jim Crow collapsed under the onslaught of the civil rights movement. He got that. But he also came to realize that these white nationalists could not believe that a race of inferiors had stripped them of their rightful power, and that there must be puppet masters pulling these inferiors' strings. And they believed that no one but the Jews, who they already thought from the protocols of the Elders of Zion, controlled the nation's government, media, and the economy, could have possibly pulled this off. So he says anti-Semitism, he says this in this essay, is a particular and potent form of racism so central to white supremacy that Black people would not win their freedom without tearing it down. And so where we see this coming out from white nationalists, here's one example. You may remember that in October of 2022, the rap singer Kanye West, also known as Ye, went on this rant against the Jewish people. And it ultimately cost him a sneaker contract, but he had a lot of support for what he was saying. Some of it came from this group, the Goyim Defense League, which has kind of interesting stunts. So they went to like an overpass over Highway 405 in Los Angeles. And they posted these signs: honk if you think Kanye was right about the Jews, no if he was right about the Jews. But the banner that really strikes me in this is not that one. It's the one on your far right, where it has two citations to the New Testament. Actually, when I saw this first in the news, some news outlets blurred that banner. They didn't want to show it. But they are the citations to the book of Revelations and the book of John, where Jesus talks about the Jews worshiping in the synagogue of Satan and that their father is the devil. And I mention this because we talk about Christian nationalism, we talk about white nationalism, and we can't pull out of that this old Christian anti-Judaism, which is part of anti-Semitism. Another thing that comes out of this era about the white nationalists is that they have come to believe that the Jews are bent on committing white genocide. They were going to destroy the white Aryan race. And you saw intimations of that with Jews replacing the right Americans, the proper Americans, in the late 19th century. But I want to point out that this idea about white genocide is really promoted by a white nationalist, a neo-Nazi named David Lane, who was involved in a murder, spent the rest of his life in jail. But at the end of his, during his jail term, he wrote a manifesto. And at the end of his manifesto, he has 14 words. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. So some of you, those of you who are local, may remember this. This was August of 2022, a couple of miles from where I live. And on the fence, you recognize the swastika as an anti-Semitic symbol. You'll recognize white power. Now you will know what 14 of 1488 stands for. It's for David Lane's last 14 words. And the 88 signals Heil Hitler, because H is the eighth letter of the alphabet. And so often people see this but don't understand this. So that's anti-Semitism from the right, and we could talk about its current manifestations. There are plenty of those. But I want to turn now to into the present anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and the left. In truth, since October 7th and what happened on the campuses, and because they make great sound bites, and because of what was going on in Congress, the focus was more on anti-Semitism on the left. But anti-Semitism on the left also has its own long history. We can go back to 1975 when the United Nations passed a resolution determining that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. We can turn to the United Nations conference in Durban in September 2001, where the anti-Semitism on display and anti-Zionism was so virulent that not only did the Israeli delegation leave the conference, but the U.S. delegation walked out. A member of that U.S. delegation was Congressman Tom Lantos, the only Holocaust survivor ever to serve in the U.S. Congress. And he said that what he saw there that day was worse than anything he had seen when he was in Budapest at the height of the Holocaust. We could also look at campus protests that preceded what happened after October 7th. A tradition developed on campuses about Israel as an apartheid state. And so in the spring, they would put up these apartheid walls. They did other things as well. This happens to be one in spring 2016 at Columbia University. And then, of course, you are all familiar with the post-October 7th protests, and encampments. So this brings me to a close in a sense, in that anti-Semitism, that's some of the background to the contemporary anti-Semitism of post-October 7th. As I said, this was not an October 7th book. I write a little bit about it at the end. I also do talk about the murders at the Capital Jewish Museum. And as I wrote that, what became a penultimate paragraph, I knew that would not be the last event that I would need to cover in this book, but that it was time to go to press. In June, the New York Times wrote, "Anti-Semitism is an urgent problem. Too many people are making excuses. Nothing can justify this bigotry. The choice is between denouncing it fully and encouraging an even broader explosion of hate." And with that, I launched the book out and into the world. This is actually the audio cover. What I would like to say in closing is that people who have read the book tell me that it does offer hope, because it shows how American Jews have overcome anti-Semitism in earlier eras, and that I think we are at the moment where it is our job to plant the seeds to do that for the future. So thank you, and I'm going to welcome Matt back, and I'm going to stop my share.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Nadell, for sharing your research and telling this important history for everyone. And for those of you with questions, feel free to go ahead and start sending some in. We have some time for that. To get us started, somebody was asking how the title of your book was chosen.
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you. The title of my book was chosen because a colleague of mine, back in the early 20 teens, wrote an article about anti-Semitism in America, and he was actually often criticized. Like, people said, like, there's no problem. Why are you writing about this? And at the end, he talked about traditions, and we have multiple traditions in this country. We have white nationalist traditions, and we have liberal traditions, and it convinced me that anti-Semitism was a long established American tradition. And you might notice, for those of you who are, fixated on grammar as I am, that it's anti-Semitism, comma, an American tradition, because I did not want a colon that would have made an American tradition the subtitle, and subtitles of books get lost.
Thank you. The next question here, what is your reaction to the Catholic Church's continuing effort to atone for its history of anti-Semitism?
I think it is very important. Many of you will know that I think it's 1964, I hope I have the right year, that Vatican II issued Nostra Aetate, which has recently, I think just maybe recently had an anniversary, and so maybe it was 65. I'm trying to remember, and the Catholic Church had blamed the Jews for all time for the death of Jesus. And the Catholic Church has a long history of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, anti-Jewish violence. And it has, in that document, it changed the official teaching about Jews across all time being blamed for the death of Jesus, and it led to very important interfaith conversations around this issue. Where you do see the issue still cropping up is in the question of the canoncy of Pius XII, the Pope during the Holocaust.
Thank you. What is your thought about anti-Israel violence or bias, sorry, and anti-Jewish bias. On the right, this person notes, on the right, anti-Semitism seems to be much more general than it is on the left, where it is largely anti-Israel.
That's interesting. Anti-Semitism on the left now is expressed mostly as anti-Israel. But anti anti-Semitism coming from the left, expressed as anti-Israel, bleeds straight into the same kind of anti-Semitism that those on the right would like to achieve, which is starting with Wilhelm Marr saying, send all the Jews back to Palestine. And why I say that is that I really do think that there's a kind of synergy between the two. So, for example, in the Soviet Union outlawed anti Semitism, but it was deeply anti Zionist. And its persecution of Jews for learning things like studying Hebrew and whether or not they intended to emigrate to Israel was something that ran across the history of the Soviet Union and ultimately leads to Soviet Jews leaving the country, and then either while the Soviet Union still stood or afterwards. And then where you see anti-Zionism bleeding into anti-Semitism is all across the Mideast and North Africa. There are about 150,000 Jews in Iraq in 1948. The Iraq government declares Zionist activity illegal. Within 3 years, well over 90% of the Jews have left the country, and ultimately Jewish communities all across North Africa and in the Middle East, estimates are somewhere between 700,000 and 850,000 Jews, fled their historic homelands because of anti-Zionism. So in the end, the result is the same that Marr wanted, and his anti-Semitism was coming from the right.
Thank you. As a follow-up, there's several questions that are being asked about the criticism of Israel being equivalent to the hatred of Jews. And there's another one here, but if you want to begin, if you have any thoughts just in general about that.
I do. There's been a number of scholars really talking about this. The For a long time, and especially before October 7th, people would say you can be anti-Zionist, you can criticize the government of the State of Israel, which, by the way, hundreds of thousands of Israelis did also, but that's not equal to anti-Semitism. And what scholars are now trying to do is to think about anti-Zionism as its own unique form of bigotry, discrimination, and hatred that's adjacent to anti-Semitism, but not exactly the same as anti-Semitism. And so the delegitimization of Israel, the singling out of Israel, the calling for the destruction of Israel, which is where 45% of the world Jews live today, that is anti-Semitic, not simply anti-Zionist.
Thank you. And seeing here, somebody was asking about more context. This is more of a historical question of Washington's letter on Judaism to the synagogue.
George Washington made a tour of the states after the Constitution was ratified. Rhode Island was the last state in the Union to ratify the Constitution, and Washington goes there in August of 1790. And the leaders of all of the churches welcomed him. They read him letters. And Washington heard the letter that was read by Moses Seixas, who was the leader of what today we call the Touro Synagogue. Back then it would have been known as the Hebrew Congregation of Newport. If you go to Newport, Rhode Island, you'll see it's kind of up on the hill, not far from the other churches. And in that letter, Seixas used language that when Washington went back and wrote a letter of thanks, that he was quoting partially from what Seixas said. And Washington's letter is the most iconic of more than 20 letters that he wrote to religious institutions, including to other synagogues. And in this, the letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport, he says that this is a country which, quote, gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And he continues that it is no more by toleration that the Jews are welcome in America. And that notion of toleration is a reflection of the fact that as Jews began to leave behind the ghettos, they were tolerated, they were permitted to live in European societies. But Washington's saying, no, Jews are citizens of America.
Thank you. And um, there's a few questions that the people have noticed from there. And if you're looking at questions, also you're welcome to spot any that you want to jump in with.
Oh, sure. It's under
Um,
Q&A.
yeah, it's on the Q&A button. I wasn't sure if you were taking a look
I
there.
only I only see a few.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. The A couple of people have noted that they felt like in the past there was more of a custom of Jews and Christians promoting mutual acceptance. And this person notes the National Conference of Jews and Christians, and was wondering how more work can be done to bring Jews and Christians together.
What's so interesting about this, these interfaith conversations, is that we really don't have serious interfaith discussions until the late 19th century. There's something called the World's Columbian Exposition. It was in Chicago, and it had a parliament of religions. And out of that parliament of religions, all sorts of different religious groups are welcomed there, and then they begin to have these conversations. And I think what maybe this question is getting at is the issue of allyship, and that Jews and Christians were allies, for example, powerful allies in the civil rights movement. And then, even then, I mean, after the Six-Day War, that begins to break down. And then, of course, since October 7th, so many of the people who Jews had counted on as allies have turned against the Jewish community, and it's a very, very difficult moment. And I do think that I think at the local level, I think things might be better than we know. For example, I was talking at a synagogue last week, and I was so heartened because the rabbi who invited me had also invited her interfaith colleagues, and many of them came to the Zoom event. So I do think maybe locally some of these bridges are being mended.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely nice to hear, and hopefully there's more of that into the future. Uh, Next question is, while there have certainly been many examples of anti-Semitism earlier than today, um, there doesn't seem to be anything that limits Jews in America from living full American lives. Am I missing something?
I think you are missing something now. I think the reason we tended to call that period of the second half of the 20th century and the first decade and a half of the 21st century the golden age is because of this perception that, Jews could rise to the highest positions in so many different fields all across American life. But now what we're seeing are boycotts in the entertainment industry, boycotts in the publishing industry, boycotts of academics and who are known to be sympathetic to Israel or whose Jewish identity is worn very proudly. And I see these boycotts as analogous to the discriminations that Jews faced in the past when they couldn't live in certain neighborhoods and when they couldn't get jobs in certain fields. And I've read amazing articles by the journalist Gabby Deutsch where she's talking about anti-Semitism in medical schools, anti-Semitism in the psychology profession, and that Jews are being targeted now in ways that yes, we can still live full lives in America, but we also sometimes have to hide our identities or leave spaces that we once thought we were accepted in. Oh, you're muted, Matt.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's it.
So with kind of continuing that conversation with your lens through history, do you anticipate repercussions of Mandani winning in New York City?
I'm certainly concerned about Mamdani's winning in New York City. I don't think anybody who's deeply concerned about Jewish life um, should not be should be concerned, frankly. Mamdani's opposition to Israel and his refusal to recognize that calling for a global intifada is calling for violence against Jews. And also, New York Jews have really been under tremendous pressure for a very, very long time. One of the things that I talked about in the book is visibly identified Jews have been subject to violence on the streets of New York for years now, way before October 7th. And that Mamdani's opposition to Israel, his threats against Israel are a huge, huge problem. New York's the most Jewish city in America. After Tel Aviv, it's the most Jewish city in the world. And while I certainly hope that he can keep many of the promises that he made, and many, many Jews voted for him. I know many Jews who did, as well as I saw the statistics. I hope that I'm not being an alarmist.
Thank you. I'm sure a couple of comments have come in saying that people are really appreciating your thoughts and such. So it's really wonderful. There's a lot more questions. We're coming to sort of the end of our conversation this evening. I'd like to ask sort of, as a final question, a few people have asked, like you've noted, planting seeds or what, if you have thoughts on where we can go from here or and such, or any final thoughts that you want to leave us with this evening.
I would say I think my final thought is very much related to what you said. I have a sense that committed Jews today are doing whatever we can in our small piece of the world to improve the situation, and that it's our duty to plant the seeds even if we aren't going to be around to see the resolution. But as a mother and a grandmother, I really hope that we will be working together so that my children and my grandchildren will see that this terrible moment that we're in, which I actually think is the high tide of American anti-Semitism, will abate and American Jews will continue to thrive here.
Yeah, thank you very much again for
Thank,
sharing your wisdom and expertise with us this evening and tackling these questions. So we all appreciate it very much.
thank you for having me.
Yeah. Good night. Take care, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.